The 2010s was marked by the rise of so-called populist leaders in many representative democracies throughout the world. These populist rulers have been derided by the establishment, politicians, and media as supposedly being a threat to the democratic institutions which they are heading. Seldom will it be explained why these populist leaders exactly are a threat to democracy. Those people accusing them will never explain how populism in and of itself is somehow this grand evil which will undermine democracy. Oftentimes the actions of these populists, if you look at them closely, are really fostering democracy and increasing participation. Searching on Google, the definition of populist comes up as a person, especially a politician, who strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by the established elite groups. So from a very basic understanding of what a populist is in that definition, you would think that populism and democracy are intimately tied up with each other by their very nature. They're so similar. And the answer is yes, that is true. Populism is tied to democracy to its very core. The next question is, then, why are we being made to think that populists want to install dictatorships? Because democracy is undergoing a semantic change. That's the reason. Using, again, a traditional Google definition for democracy, it's a system of government by the whole population, or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. But because of semantic shift, where a word changes its meaning over time, democracy is shifting away from that definition towards a system of government which fosters radical sexual liberation, radical feminism, and the liquidation of traditional ethnic and national boundaries. This can be in conjunction with what is traditionally viewed as a democratic process, or explicitly over and against a democratic process. Often, this system has a democratic process which is essentially like a ceremonial appendix, like the British Queen or the Japanese Emperor. They are purely symbolic in nature. The democratic process might be occurring, but its outcomes are essentially indifferent to what really happens at the end of the day as history goes forward. Often the bureaucracy acts on its own, or a system of courts form a critarchy which chooses completely above the democratic process and the elected leaders' heads what the social programs of the state will be. And why is there this semantic change which has shifted democracy away from a process and into a description of a radical social program? The simple answer is that the elite have abandoned, or in the process of abandoning, liberalism in the favor of an ideology I call post-liberalism. Why is there this shift away from liberalism in all its traditional forms to this post-liberalism? That's because the Republican forces of government are inherently geared towards rule by an oligarchy, and the expansion of suffrage to the general populace is simply an accident of history, which I said before only really acts as appendix in how policy is truly formed. The governments where decisions are made by groups always fall into becoming oligarchies. Now, an oligarchy is described as a system of government overseen by oligarchs, a group of men, usually a very small group, which shares power between themselves. Oligarchs are often extremely rich, and their business interests encompass large portions of the nation's economy. As such, in an oligarchy, there is a little divide between the business interests of the oligarchs and the policy of the state. Indeed, state policy is often chosen expressly for the benefit of the oligarchs over and against the will of the populace. The reality of oligarchy should be self-evident when you look through the current republics and constitutionally restrained monarchs throughout this world. Some historical commentators would see liberalism as nothing more than something like a Ponzi scheme, which allows oligarchs to control society through a thin guise of freedom. And even if this, I would say, is quite an accurate description of what occurs in liberal states, let's look at what liberalism says it is in good faith and take liberal theorists at their face value while describing what they believe and prescribe. Liberal scholars point towards the Enlightenment as the genesis of liberalism as an ideology. While there is some definite truth to the idea that the Enlightenment gave birth to liberalism, many, if not the majority of the philosophers in the Enlightenment were deeply critical of liberalism and democracy. Much of their political theory supported absolutism, and especially the idea of the enlightened monarch, over a republic and a popular participation of the populace in the organs of that government. Yet many of the foundations which would become liberalism are found in writers such as Locke, Montesquieu, Mill, and Rousseau, although very piecemeal. It would be kind of absurd to even point to any of these characters, these founders of the Enlightenment and retrospectively liberalism, and say that they're a modern liberal. It would be laughable to say something like that. Now, going forward, the first attempted liberal republics were the United States, which declared its independence in 1776, and the first French Republic, where its revolution began around 1789. And of course, during the rises of both these states, the United Kingdom was going through this transformation from a traditional monarchy into a liberal state, which has a ceremonial monarchy as this appendix role, right? Ironically, even though we point towards the United States or the French First Republic as the start of liberalism, the United Kingdom was probably far more along with the development of liberalism at any one point throughout the 19th century and the 18th century. From here, liberalism would spread throughout Europe and to the nations which Western Europeans colonized. From the Second World War, and especially in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, liberalism has not just become the most popular form of government in the world, but it's perhaps seen as a default form of government, which every single nation has to reckon with or try to create liberalism with its national characteristics. So a liberalism with Filipino characteristics, a liberalism with Brazilian characteristics, a liberalism with Russian characteristics. And indeed, the Filipino, Brazilian, and Russian states are all liberal states. Yet, just as democracy has semantically changed from a procedural mechanism into a support for radical social upheaval, so too has liberalism semantically changed into a system which is fundamentally illiberal. For a lack of a better name, I am calling this new ideology post-liberalism. Well-meaning but ignorant commentators on the mainstream right will call post-liberalism communism or socialism. While post-liberalism is no doubt an authoritarian left-wing ideology like Marxism-Leninism, it is quite distinct from any form of socialism that has ever existed. Socialism is probably even worse than capitalism, the most notoriously ill-defined term. I would say the most coherent definition for socialism, though, is an economic system in which the means of production are collectively held and controlled. Now, whether that's by guilds, unions, syndicates, or the state itself. Further, confusingly, many ignorant members of the right and left, the mainstream right and left that is, will label a government which offers welfare programs, very laughable, as socialist. This misconception has reached to such great lengths that many leftists will actually identify as socialist when they are the most prototypical and generic post-liberals. Furthermore, conservatives and even libertarians will loathe the term liberal, yet be completely ignorant that they are clearly liberal. Actually, they're far more liberal than the modern mainstream left. In fact, it is quite rare for any political party throughout the West to not be liberal, up until now, that is. Indeed, for a political party to be not liberal in a representative democracy, it would actively be campaigning to undermine the institutions of the state, is the explicit goal of its ideological campaign. Now, if you take a party like the Front National, the traditional Front National of Le Pen, and you take the left communist of the 1980s, both these political parties, if they were elected and they preserved the procedural system of democracy, really they would be liberal. Because no matter how quote-unquote right-wing or left-wing a politician you may be, if you adhere to the laws of the democratic system and you transfer and surrender power peacefully and adhere to the liberals' understanding of the rule of law, then you fall within liberalism. Now, why are the post-liberals not falling within that? Well, the post-liberals don't really believe in elections as what should confer power. They have a much more technocratic and authoritarian theory, and as far as elections matter to them, they're willing to rig them, however obvious it may be. This semantic shift of people that identify themselves as liberals but actually being something completely opposed to liberalism is no doubt, one, a result of the decline of education, two, a result of general decline in intelligence, and three, the natural result of entropy. Indeed, the two main rising left-wing ideologies of the 21st century, post-liberalism, and, it's literally called socialism in the 21st century, are bastardized, stupider, vulgar, and messier versions of the left-wing ideologies of the 20th and 19th century. And should we be surprised that these are the coming ideologies, these stupid, vulgar, rising to ideologies? No, because the industrial state actively selects for stupidity. And the world intelligence, world global G, is in decline for the foreseeable future. Indeed, the replacement of liberalism with post-liberalism is to a great extent the result of declining institutions which no longer have the human capital to function as they were originally intended. As such, the rise of post-liberalism as a powerful political force in the West is intimately connected to a process which I have called the global democratic backslide. Following the victory of the United States over the Axis powers and then the Warsaw Pact, liberalism has become the de facto form of government. So the majority of nations will make claims to being liberal or democratic, whether or not their state truly can be considered either. Now, going back, there are numerous ideologies or things that call themselves ideologies that would fall under liberalism. You got classical liberalism, libertarianism, social liberalism, neoconservatism, and even social democracy. All these things, I would say, fall under liberalism. But post-liberalism doesn't, and I'll go through each of the foundational identifying factors in liberalism over and against post-liberalism. So with liberalism, let's talk about free speech. You have free speech for each individual. Most of the limitations traditionally have only been related to provoking violence or some kind of connection with profanity or pornography. These conservative liberal societies before the 1960s, what they're really stomping down on was, pornography. And of course, post-liberalism is aggressively pro-pornography and all kinds of sexual promiscuity. They think that is the main, when they defend free speech, they think that it's mostly to allow the most profane art possible. Now let's look at post-liberalism. You have highly politicized speech codes, and now you have the rise of explicitly illegal speech. This is known as hate speech, right? Where anything in hate speech is identical to like heresy within more religious times of the past. So like the Catholic Church and in the Islamic world, where if you said heresy and blasphemy, you would be clamped down on. Now in the post-liberal system, any type of so-called hate speech, you'll be clamped down on. You will be sued, and in certain parts of Canada, it's very insane because you'll put before human tribunals and tortured in weird psychological ways. So, but hate speech makes illegal criticism of protected classes, and this is something we're going to go along with further down the road, the idea of the protected class in post-liberalism versus the freedom and equality of every individual. Also is illegal is criticism of historical narratives which buttress state power, most infamously the Holocaust. Criticism of the traditional exterminationist program is illegal throughout almost all of Europe, right? And certain framings of colonialism, certain framings of the settlement of the Americas, and certain framings of transatlantic and America's slavery are essentially outlawed, and you can't get tenure if you support them, right? Alex Jones, a few days ago, is starting to get sued for saying Sandy Hook didn't happen. And now Sandy Hook is, the Holocaust denial, if you will, in the United States. And it's this Holocaust denialism, this language, you are a denier, and that is hate speech to deny, is spreading quickly into the world of science. And it looks like science is going to be a lot more restrictive than history is, ironically, because discussion of the coronavirus, numerous perspectives, explicitly hate speech, discussion of anthropology, discussion of global warming. These are sciences which are off the table to be examined under the scientific method. The ruling powers have kicked them off the menu for discussion. And, there is this kind of Venn diagram, right, with hate speech, where some states, there's more, explicitly illegal things up front to say, more things like saying Sandy Hook didn't happen. It's, theoretically you could say that, but in America you'll be sued to death and be forced to pay exorbitant fines for it. So you have fines, explicit jail time in Germany with the Holocaust. And then you also have the rise of paramilitaries acting as unofficial arbiters for the will of the state. And one final thing, and I forgot to say this earlier, not recognizing the chosen genders of transsexuals. That is falling under hate speech now, of course. Speaking of these paramilitaries, in the United States, the two most famous ones, Black Lives Matter and Antifa, let's talk about the rule of law, something that's deeply, deeply important to liberalism, and that's the belief that each individual in society is subject to the same laws. Each individual is equal, whether the richest person, the homeless, man, woman, they're all equal before the law. If they break the law, then they will be jailed or fined according to how they broke it, regardless of their stature. Obviously, the real world is corrupt and messy, but this is the ideal. And the law will also protect your private property, and there will be law enforcement to protect you and your private property. Now let's go over to post-liberalism. In post-liberalism, you have anarcho-tyranny. The belief that repeat offending criminals need to be policed less and punished less severely for their transgressions. Indeed, under anarcho-tyranny, criminals are victims, and normal people who want criminals to be pursued and punished for their crimes, those are the aggressors. The criminals are the victims. So what ends up happening is law-abiding citizens need to be policed very heavily and punished very severely for any minor transgressions that they may do, right? The Black Lives Matter movement can burn down cities, and people that are loosely affiliated with them can loot as much as they want. But the man who wants to go to church during a COVID lockdown, he'll be put in jail. He'll be severely fined. That's the system of anarcho-tyranny. The criminal are allowed to do whatever they want because they're the victims of the normal citizen. And the normal citizen will be heavily policed, heavily fined, and heavily watched over by this authoritarian state. Now, anarcho-tyranny kind of arises as a de facto thing out of corruption to a certain extent, or the functional use for the state, but sometimes people literally ideologically believe in anarcho-tyranny, right? There is a growing, it's not like crazy. Numerous people believe that the police should be abolished and that prisons should be abolished. And again, anarcho-tyranny, the police fall out of fashion, and you have these paramilitaries that really are used to intimidate the law-abiding citizens in their place. Now, liberalism necessarily isn't nationalistic, but at least most forms of liberalism were pro-civic nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Indeed, in the revolutions of 1848, liberalism was highly intertwined with these nationalistic movements, seeking either to unify an ethnic group, say the Italians or the Germans, or the Southern Slavs with Yugoslavia, or gain an independence for one nation as an ethnic group. So we have the rise of the nation state, the rise of Greece getting its independence from the Turks, and the rise of all the nations in the Balkans, the rise of the nations in the Middle East, like Iraq and Syria, the rise of the African states in the end of decolonialism, right? The rise of the global defining dominant setup for a state is this ethnic group is supposed to match the government. You have nation states. And then in traditional liberalism, you have the belief that states act rationally towards peace and free trade, and this rational action will in and of itself promote and enforce state sovereignty. Now let's flip over. What does post-liberalism believe? Post-liberalism believes in globalism. Post-liberalism defines itself as metaphysically opposed to any type of particularism for any ethnic group. Of course, this particularism in the favor of any ethnic group or religious group is especially the most vehement towards what we call nationalism. It seeks to radically transform traditional nations through mass immigration. Immigrants then will be given more rights as protected groups within their host nations over and above the native born. And in settler nations, this includes indigenous groups gaining more rights. And right in India, where you have the caste system, the lower caste will be given more rights above the higher castes. Then, in order to further bolster this decline of traditional ethnic groups and nations, miscegenation is aggressively promoted by the states as an auxiliary to break up either the settler majorities in the New World and Oceania, or in Europe, the indigenous peoples. The stated official goal is global governance, which will effectively end nations, and sometimes they want to not just end nations in a de facto sense. They want nations to be directly absorbed into superstates like the European Union. Globalism doesn't really recognize equality of states. North Korea and China and the United States, the Soviet Union, Uganda, these aren't equal powers. They would be in traditional liberalism, but under globalism and post-liberalism, there's the idea of the moralistic intervention, where post-liberalism has to be spread by force. You have to destroy the enemies in this aggressive, crusading, moralistic vision to spread more and more social liberalism, right? Acceptance of homosexuals and feminism at the forepoint across the world under the guise of so-called human rights. Also, globalists really are for building international organizations, like I said before, the banking ones, and European Union, United Nations, to undermine and curtail state sovereignty. Now let's talk about secularism or religious neutrality. Famously, under liberalism, the state is supposed to be actively neutral towards religion and not promote any single religion to the detriment of any other. Religion is to be removed from the public sphere and only practiced in private. Now let's turn over to post-liberalism. Post-liberalism, as I discussed before, is often working hand in hand with a civic religion I call woke-ism. In the post-liberal system, you have the promotion of the civic religion of wokeism into the public sphere, and it will synchronize with religions that are, let's say, denatured. The so-called liberal Christians, groups like Unitarian Universalists, the Episcopal Church, the Church of England, the liberal Methodists, things like this, the liberal Jews, the liberal Muslims, Baha'is. These groups kind of synchronistically match up with wokeism. And then you also sometimes, in like Canada and Australia, these settler colonies, they promote the religions of the indigenous minority. And, you know, in Canada it gets to the point where the state, in its functions, actively have ceremonial and ritualistic Indian and Reconstructionist Indian religions promoted. And in the point in the 2000s, you could really say, oh, well, post-liberalism was going to promote the new atheist movement, right? And it was going to be more aggressively secular. And it was going to promote atheism, but that's really fallen out. And that's because for them to push forward multiculturalism, then they can't be anti-religious, because these multiple cultures they're promoting over Western culture, they have their own religions, and it would undermine their cultures to be actively atheistic. So you've seen this shift through the teens into the 20s towards promoting wokeism and the syncretic versions of traditional religions. Now let's go back to traditional liberalism. In traditional liberalism, as it went on, you saw this building force, this idea of one man, one vote. And most liberal societies, they're representative democracies, where leaders are elected and represent the people for them, and they vote on behalf of the people. While post-liberal states may have representative democracies, they're largely more and more becoming this appendix rule. And as I said before, you have the rise of the critarchy. The judges decide social policy. And you have things like Justin Trudeau, without any kind of legal process, just outlying pistols, right? So they'll use the media to kind of gain this fervor to act in a non-democratic fashion. And more over time, this is the democratic system, this traditional procedural system, is undermined. And of course, going back to one man, one vote, the protected classes, most notably homosexuals and the various abrosexuals, it's increasing every day. The different types of queers, you could say, this queer umbrella, they have this huge position. All minorities are put over the majority. In a certain sense, you could call this the rule by the minority, post-liberalism. Now let's go back down. This connects back into this popular sovereignty. That's the traditional liberal idea. The belief that the government's policy should be the will of the people, and that the government is to enact the will of the people. Post-liberalism operates not just under, this more realistic, cynical view of popular sovereignty, something like guided popular sovereignty, where the media is used to kind of generate opinions and guide what the public wants. Indeed, that's happening. But it's even abandoned that sort of thing, and it's moving towards outright technocracy. Both elected officials and members of the bureaucracy see their jobs as trying to not enact the will of the people. Instead, they are chosen as competent experts who will enact policies not in accordance with popular will, but ideologically in accordance to the popular norms of post-liberalism. So you saw this in Trump's administration, where every person they appointed in the bureaucracy would just straight up refuses orders. And that they don't think that they're there to follow the elected official at the minimum, let alone the popular sovereignty, the will of the people. They're there over and against the will of the people. They're there to shape and form the state and the will of the people. They are customers of the state. They aren't the owners of the state, the creators of the policy. They are something to be dealt with in policy. Then, of course, let's go back to traditional liberalism. You have the right to assemble, which acts in accordance to free speech and popular sovereignty, where people are allowed to assemble in public places to protest, advocate, and spread their political movements. And this helps them network with allies to make their movements stronger. Now you see the rise of the selective right to assemble, right? Where, especially the paramilitary groups, where they're allowed to do anything they want, loot and burn down cities, riot freely. But every single cause of the system gets protest for it. And there's this huge disconnect where these protesters are advocating the direct policies of the state and think that they're rebelling against it, that they're protesting it, when they're literally advocating for the very policies and ideology of the state itself. Something that is kind of interesting is that both post-liberalism and all the other types of liberalism have free market capitalism. My friend Arjun, when I was discussing with this, he thinks that post-liberalism has kind of this disdain for workers' rights. I don't know, it might just be the higher echelons of the middle class are opposed to workers' rights. I don't know if post-liberalism is necessarily any more opposed to unionization than traditional liberalism is. So let's move on. So you have legal equality in traditional liberalism. Again, we talked about this a little bit. Each individual is legally equal to each other one. Each individual is supposed to be punished or rewarded basically in accordance with following the law. But in post-liberalism, you kind of have this stack of protected classes where the higher levels of the protected classes, for instance, are able to do whatever they want. And you see this in monkeypox, right? Where the protected class of the homosexuals and the various queer identities can do whatever orgies they are and undermine the public health. But, straight people couldn't be married during the coronavirus. So this is something that's really important that we got to talk about too. And so traditional liberalism, you had this idea of moral neutrality, the respect for the plurality of opinion, and kind of institutional tolerance. So let's say in traditional liberalism, let's just find a hobby I like, right? You like Godzilla, right? And Godzilla and Gamera and Ultraman and that kind of fandom, it's not subject to ideology. You're just talking about, the effects in those movies, the backstory to them, the lore, the collecting of, all the various figures, the different suits, and how they're constructed. That's what it's centered around. And under post-liberalism, which is increasing politicization of all society, you gotta have transsexual representation in Godzilla or something, right? Like that, right? And so go to Dungeons and Dragons, something else I'm interested in, right? So you go back to when America was a liberal society before it transformed into a post-liberal society, and you pick up AD&D 1, right? Version 1, you pick up original Dungeons and Dragons, you pick up 2nd edition, you pick up 3rd edition, and I think even to a certain extent 4th edition, and you'll see the books and the whole subculture of RPG games is really just for you to play it. The focus of Dungeons and Dragons is playing Dungeons and Dragons. But now when we move to 5th edition, while the rules aren't like you must be a transsexual and so on, the entire culture of Dungeons and Dragons is geared towards denigrating the traditional fans. It's geared towards promoting the various hobby horses of ideology of the post-liberal and wokeist religion. And this is occurring in every single aspect, every single fandom. Whether from, kaiju films, tokusatsu in the West, and Dungeons and Dragons, Western RPGs, video games, television, comic books are probably the most worst affected, just destroyed and gutted by the post-liberal regime. Everything in post-liberalism has to actively push forward the ideology of the state. So, back then under liberalism, if somebody was a Republican or a Democrat, right, they would go to the same barbecue. You would be friends with the same members of your family. My uncle is a Republican, my sister is a Democrat, but you're still family. But under the regime of post-liberalism, there is no neutral space. You have to cut off your family in favor of the post-liberal ideology and its connected religion, wokeism. You have to destroy the original Dungeons and Dragons books in favor of post-liberalism. And it's moving towards this aggressive, active transformation of society. And you get towards the fallout, and liberalism has it built into this, right? The paradox of tolerance. Do you tolerate the intolerant? And that's always been this problem, is like Hitler can be elected in liberalism and end liberalism, right? Well, in post-liberalism, you have this fundamental, fervent zeal to close that gap to the so-called possible or traditional victims groups like homosexuals or blacks in the United States. Any possible ability for there to be this paradox of intolerance must be crushed with the most aggressive authoritarian zeal. This is overwhelming fear to try and prevent, to undermine the family, to protect the minority of the queer, right? That is post-liberalism, and that is what defines it. It has the same aggressive zeal is the Maoists during the Cultural Revolution. And that is what is helping form this post-liberalism into this new authoritarian system, which is unlike, the traditional conservatives, if you will, and the liberals, the social democrats, the libertarians. It does not fall under liberalism. And maybe it's a transitory phase, right, towards a new authoritarian system, which will be given a better name and a more fitting name. It doesn't echo in the name of post-liberalism because of, it's being a semantic slave and following this change of democracy and liberalism as words. But we'll see. Maybe post-liberalism won't hold forever. Maybe they'll be populist of the left, as you see in countries like South Africa and Venezuela, and it's spreading throughout Latin America with the socialism of the 21st century. And post-liberalism will break down, and you'll just have, aggressive and authoritarian welfare states, which comedically take the wealth from the working and the middle class and the upper class, except for a few plutocrats at the top, and steal it and give it as chump change to the poor, the gutter, right? But we'll have to see if post-liberalism will continue decades ahead, or it will ultimately fall out as intelligence in our civilization crumbles.